Dobro večer, iznimno mi je drago ponovno pozdraviti vas na drugom danu Festivala svjetske književnosti, na tribini Razotkrivanje. Naši gost večeras je Philipp Blom, iznimno zanimljiv publicist, romanopisac, čovjek koji fluentno govori nekoliko jezika, autor niza zanimljivih knjiga, autor knjige koju smo objavili ove godine, ako se ne varam, Vrtoglave godine, knjige koja govori o Europi između 1900. i 1914. i koja nevjerojatno korespondira sa našim suvremenim vremenom. Molim vas jedan pljesak za gospodina Bloma. Razgovor će voditi ugledni hrvatski publicist, čovjek koji je uredio ovu knjigu, gospodin Vukom Perišić. Da biste stekli dojam kako gospodin Blom piše, naši glumci će vam pročitati ulomak iz knjige.
Iracionalni revolt bio je revolt protiv samog modernizma. Sadržavao ideju drevne i nepromjenjive esencije čovjeka nasuprot nestabilnih identiteta gradskog stanovništva, a artikulirao se u muškoj odmazdi protiv ranog feminizma, u nasilju i kultu muževnosti, u reakcionarnoj politici. No nije bio zagledan u prošlost u svim svojim aspektima. Imao je važnu ulogu i u futurizmu, avangardnoj umjetnosti i znanstvenim teorijama rase, u misticizmu i karijerama različitih ljudi poput Williama Butlera Yeatsa, Jamesa Joycea, Adolfa Hitlera i Marka Rothka. Kult iracionalizma bio je važan i za tako inkompatibilne pokrete kakvi su apstraktni modernizam i fašizam.
No sada već trčimo pred rudom. Na početku knjige pozvao sam vas na jedan misaoni eksperiment. Da zamislite navalu knjiških crva koji žderu knjige i tako nam oduzimaju sve informacije o 20. stoljeću nakon srpnja 1914. Samo takva, pomalo bizarna perspektiva može nam, mislim, omogućiti razumijevanje razdoblja, koje je veoma zasjenjeno događajima koji su uslijedili i kojega se odveć često poima kao taoca povijesne neizbježnosti. I samo mu takva perspektiva može vratiti otvorenu budućnost. Svi znamo što se dogodilo u kolovozu 1914. i kako je rat obilježio 20. stoljeće i ostavio ožiljke na njegovu licu. No u ovoj sam knjizi dokidanje te perspektive smatrao nužnim, kako bih otkrio razdoblje iznutra, ne interpretirajući ga retrospektivno, nego onako kako su ga vidjeli oni koji su ga proživjeli. Nitko ne bi interpretirao 90. godine 20. stoljeća isključivo iz perspektive 11. rujna 2001. optužujući svijet jer nije predvidio što će se dogoditi. Slično tome, nitko ne bi trebao gledati na godine prije 1914. očekujući da će naći proročansku svijest o grozotama i brigama budućnosti.
U razdoblju do 1914. je proces uključivanja u epohu masovne industrijske proizvodnje dominirao životima mnogih ljudi, njihovim mislima i osjećajima. Unatoč tvrdnji Virginia Woolf, nitko nije bio potpuno modern već oko 1910. godine kao ni danas. Različita razdoblja i različiti načini gledanja na svijet koji egzistiraju ne samo u društvima, nego čak i u pojedincima. Modernistički junaci kulturne povijesti imali su svatko svoje predrasude koje su pokazivale da su ukorijenjeni u konvencionalnoj kulturi. Schnitzler je prezirao eksperimentalno slikarstvo i nije cijenio avangardnu glazbu. Picasso je bio ravnodušan prema glazbi i nikad nije čuo za Schnitzlera. Stravinski nikad nije išao u kazalište osim poslovno, a njegov ukus za slikarstvo bio je vrlo konzervativan. Mentaliteti i identiteti često se prepliču kroz generacije, stvarajući složene i podijeljene ličnosti, a to je samo po sebi sastavni dio modernizma, što je došlo do osobito dramatskog izražaja u fragmentarnom karakteru modernističke umjetnosti i filozofije.
Identiteti novih muškaraca i žena toga vremena bili su uvijek rastrgani između starih lojalnosti i novih aspiracija, između nostalgije i društvene realnosti. Bili su prolazni i opsjednuti krhkošću, propadanjem, impotencijom i stalno su se borili da održe korak s društvenim realnostima koje su se neprestano mijenjale. Promjene su se odvijale prebrzo, racionalnost je nadvladala iskustvo. Ljudi su se osjećali kao da su zaključani u nekontroliranom automobilu, poput Henry Adamsa ili kao Max Weber u vlaku koji nema polazišta ni odredišta. To ubrzanje bez smjera izazvalo je u ljudima vrtoglavicu. Vrtoglavicu su osjećali svi, bez obzira na kulturne i ideološke podjele. Pisci toga doba govorili su o sebi i drugima ne samo kao o novim muškarcima i novim ženama, nego i u zemljama njemačkog govornog područja kao o Übergangsmenschen, ljudima u tranziciji. Ništa više nije bilo isto i ništa još nije poprimilo novi fiksirani oblik. Naš svijet i naše intelektualne i emocionalne horizonte oblikovali su ti tranzicijski ljudi. Strah i uzbuđenje tvorili su izvanredno kreativnu tenziju, ishodište gotovo svake ideje i društvenog fenomena koji će dominirati 20. stoljećem. Socijalizma i fašizma, nuklearne fizike i teorije relativnosti, konceptualne umjetnosti i potrošačkog društva, mas medija i demokratizacije, feminizma i psihoanalize. U mnogo pogleda 20. stoljeće samo ostvarilo snove i noćne more koji su nastali u kreativnom previranju razdoblja od 1900. do 1914.
Ja bih dodao još jedan kratki citat. Nikada prije nije postojalo toliko razloga da se bude optimističan, a nikada prije ljudi nisu gledali u budućnost sa toliko nepovjerenja. To je doba koje je teško zamisliti iz naše perspektive, ali postoji jedno pomagalo pomoću koje bismo mogli to pokušati. Naša generacija je doživjela tehnološku revoluciju sa internetom i mobilnim telefonima. Tada su ljudi doživjeli upotrebu samog telefona koja je postala masovna. Masovnu upotrebu električne struje, pojavio se automobilizam, pojavile su se robne kuće, lokomotive su dosegle brzinu od 200 km na sat, došlo je do masovne proizvodnje, urbanizacije, Rengen i Freud su svaki na svoj način zavirili u ljudsku nutrinu. Dakle, udobnost je postala dostupna. Međutim, kako se čini, ljudi su se uplašili. Zašto su se ljudi uplašili tih pogodnosti?
Well, good evening. Among the many languages I don't speak, unfortunately, is yours. And after listening to these extracts, more than ever, I have to say that I don't understand myself. But thank you for the invitation here. I've only been here today so far, and what a wonderful city you have. I hope to explore it more, but as for now, I'm in love. But your question, why did people get scared? Well, people are still running scared. People are still running scared of this thing that nobody can quite define, but that is dominating and indeed perhaps overwhelming all our lives, which we call modernity.
Excuse me for a moment. That's the point. I'm asking you why they were scared, because they are scared today also.
Well, I think it is quite easy to see why you would run scared of this thing. I mean, it is the old thing that with freedom you lose orientation. An English sociologist put it very brilliantly, I think, very quickly. He said, we have exchanged a sense of place for a sense of space. Now, place is something that is very specific, very local. Space is the three-dimensional stuff around us. We have learned to dominate space. We have learned to expand into the world. We have learned to understand how the world works. But this sense of place, this being rooted, we have all lost. And that is, on one hand, terribly liberating and really amazing and wonderful, and has given many of us, all women for instance, possibilities that they would have never had before. But also, of course, it means that we have now got to construct meaning ourselves, and that is a very hard thing to do. Perhaps it's even an impossible thing, we don't yet know. In the book, I try to compare, or try to sort of tell a little parable of two French workers. And I said, well, let's call the man Pierre. And Pierre comes from the Languedoc in the southwest of France. And he is a wine farmer because everybody there is. And he's called Pierre because his grandfather was called Pierre. And he was born in the house that his great-grandfather was born in. And he is a Protestant because people in the Languedoc are Protestant. And you get the picture, his life is already there. And now the problem is, one day Pierre's father calls Pierre and says, I'm sorry, but we haven't got enough, I haven't got enough to inherit you. There are 3 other boys to take care of, and agriculture is less and less productive, or less and less lucrative. You have to go. You have to become a worker. Now, there is a global history background to his father telling him that, because this is already around 1900 a global market. Already in highly industrialized country, most of what people eat comes from Russia, from Canada, from Argentina, from Australia, from New Zealand, and is imported. So, of course, in Europe, agriculture begins to be harder. So Pierre goes to Paris, and he starts working in a factory that was set up by somebody called Renault, and he makes this new thing called a car. And you know, Pierre feels really good about himself, and he meets Marie, and Marie comes from the Bretagne, and I can't tell you Marie's story, but you get it already. She's Catholic because the Bretagne is extremely conservative and Catholic, and she's called Marie because her grandfather, etc., her grandmother. But Pierre and Marie get married. Now, that a Protestant and a Catholic would have got married would have been almost impossible, but they live in the city now. Now, first of all, they won't have 6 or 8 children. They will have 2 or 3. A huge revolution. But in the city, children can't be used to work on the farm and to be your old age insurance. In the city, children cost money. Everything indeed costs money. You can't just grow your own vegetables. You can't just have your own livestock. Everything that you do costs money. That is a new thing as well in the lives of these people. But then, how they form their entire lives, the newspapers they read, the political parties they may be interested in, the sports club Pierre may support, perhaps the emancipation club Marie may go to fight for the rights of women. These are all elective things. They're choices. In their old lives or the lives of their parents, there were very few choices to make, which meant that if you were not like everybody else, you had a very hard time. If you were Jewish, or if you were a woman who had actually ambition and wanted to make something out of her life, or for that matter, perhaps a man who wanted to do that, if you were gay, etc., your life was hell. But for most people, it was sort of okay, and it meant they didn't have to make many decisions in their lives. In a city, you have to make hundreds of decisions. You have to construct yourself out of a patchwork of little elements, which is what the Cubists then picked up on. You know, they show people made up of little fragments. They're no longer of one whole. They are now fragmented people. And we are still fragmented people. We are still, you know, we no longer live in a world where we have certainties that we have to believe in, where we have strong traditions that buttress us and make us who we are. But these things have become much more weakened, and in exchange we have taken so much more in from the world. But it means that creating yourself is active work. And also, of course, it's not only the challenge of creating yourself, but also this world, this great modernist capitalist world, can completely crush and flatten you. Famously, it did that with a class of people that began before the First World War but moved on to after the First World War. And that was the class of small tradesmen, the class of small artisans, this class of small shopkeepers who could no longer compete with factories. Before the First World War, and incidentally, this is quite an interesting chain. What do you lose? You lose certainty. What comes into the world before the First World War? Insurances, life insurances, a new kind of certainty. Risk has become incalculable, but at least financially you can calculate it. Now, in order to do that, they measured hundreds of thousands of people and calculated their health risks. From that, we also get ready-made clothes, because all of a sudden you could, measure standards, have standard sizes. Now, these clothes were produced so much more cheaply than the little tailor around the corner could make it, that the little tailor was most likely to lose his job or no longer take an apprentice. These were the people who then voted for Adolf Hitler or for Benito Mussolini or for other right-wing fascist traditionalist in many ways, also utopian, but mainly a socially traditionalist political leaders, because this world, if you don't watch it or if you're standing on the wrong side of it by accident, it can crush and flatten you. If you stand on the right side of it by accident, you can do phenomenally well out of it. But that means it is, of course, an ambivalent new reality. But it is a new reality that nobody can ignore, that nobody can just pretend isn't there. It has become the overwhelming reality of people's lives. And that is still so. I mean, we are living now in a time when, well, I personally think, and I'm actually just trying to write a book about that within the next 30 years our world will completely change in ways that we can't even imagine yet. And the main factor of that, and that is nothing new, is climate change. But if you only think that the Syrian refugees that are coming to Europe at the moment, they are an indirect consequence of climate change. Because in the last 10 years, the conditions for agriculture in many regions of Syria became so bad that many farmers simply gave up and moved into the cities. And there they formed, a large, not very educated slum population without many chances of getting on in life. That was the original people that the social unrest against Assad's regime was drawn from, and also a lot of recruits for ISIS. So these things are beginning to change our world in ways that we can't even begin to imagine yet. So I think it's interesting to look back at history and see what happened the last times that things changed so much, so radically. And I'm particularly interested in these moments when these changes happen. So I think the time before the First World War is one of those moments. Now I'm sort of going back a little bit in time, but we're not here to speak about that, but to look at the last time that a great climate change occurred, and that was in the 17th century. It was called the Little Ice Age. And Europe became much colder for a while, and that made Europe from a late medieval continent to an early modern continent within 100 years. So what happens in the next generation or so to us will be momentous, will be something that we don't even have the imagination to understand yet. But because of that, I find it particularly interesting to look back at history to see how have people coped the last times. What were the things that were perhaps beneficial? What were the things that were disastrous? And I think since the 17th century, and this of course is no accident because the 17th century is also the beginning of the Enlightenment, since the 17th century it's this huge engine and this also destructive engine of modernity that has driven our lives. It has begun then quite slowly. In the 20th century it sped up phenomenally, and now it's getting even faster.
Možemo reći da je prijelaz stoljeća i početak 20. stoljeća bio veliki trijumf razuma. Istodobno taj trijumf je uplašio ljude. I iz radova intelektualaca tadašnjeg vremena, iz umjetničkih dijela, prepoznajemo oduševljenje iracionalnim. Dakako da tu treba spomenuti Freuda i njegov pristup seksualnosti, ali i nekakve druge ljude koji su obožavali mistiku, koji su doživljavali modernu kao oslobađanje od okova, se razum doživljavao kao okov, koji će sada, gdje će sada biti oslobođeni ljudski porivi. U najširem smislu te riječi. Koliko je iracionalnost konstanta, antropološka konstanta čovjeka i kako s njom rukovati? Možemo li s njom rukovati?
Wow. First of all, I don't feel I'm the right person to answer that, but...
Nobody is,
no,
in fact.
Perhaps nobody
That
is.
means everybody can.
But here, again, I need to go back a little bit. The Enlightenment has saddled us with the illusion of being rational creatures, of being rational organisms, dominated by reason, by rational analysis, by ethical principles that we can follow, by a sort of cost and advantage calculation that we can all make at all points. And this Enlightenment tradition, which is incidentally originally a Catholic Christian tradition, but which becomes secularized in the Enlightenment. What used to be the Christian soul becomes Enlightenment reason. This Enlightenment tradition goes back into what people now a little bit imprecisely call neoliberal economics, where also people are seen as rational agents in a market of information. Now that, of course, is not only nonsense, I would say it is actually religion, because I don't know who of you have children, but I've got news for you, and it's bad, because that was the worst decision you could make as an economic actor. It makes you poorer, it makes you more vulnerable, it gives you fewer choices, it ties you to a certain place. Having children shouldn't happen in a neoliberal economic model. I don't want to talk about that, because that leads us a little bit too far, but I think this Enlightenment illusion that we are rational beings was counteracted very strongly already during the Enlightenment by, to my mind, more interesting philosophers such as Denis Diderot, who said, actually, no, we're animals. And animals live basically to have sex and to reproduce. We are passionate creatures. We are creatures driven by instinct. And we can use rationality to perhaps realize these instincts a little bit more constructively. We can use rationality perhaps to use an 18th century metaphor like a sailing ship that can't influence the great tides and streams of passion or the winds that come from different sides. But it can set the sails in an intelligent way to get in the direction it wants finally. But we are not rational creatures. We are passionate animals. We are, we are a kind of primate with not very much hair. Now, this is not the view that we have inherited. We have inherited the view of the rational human actor. And I think it's a very poor model, because most of what drives us, most of what gets us out of bed in the morning is irrational, is emotional, sexual, is eros in the widest sense. Eros can also be intellectual, eros can be an eros of friendship, but that is what drives us. So I don't think we can eliminate irrationality, because irrationality is who we are. But at the same time, that of course means that this irrational drive, which we have so strongly, you can't answer it rationally. You can only answer it irrationally. And in a world that peppers us with rational answers, with statistics, with numbers, with analyses, that part of us is not satisfied. Now, you can try to be very sophisticated about it, like Diderot was in the 18th century, who said, I feel that part in me very strongly. I would like to be religious, but damn it, I can't, because I know it to be wrong. So I have to learn to live with this urge. I have to learn to live with this urge for meaning, for a great whole, for a great communion, even if I can't realize it rationally. No, but that's a very sophisticated approach. That's perhaps okay for a few people who are really willing to put in the work in thought and in action to live like that. Now, what we are left with from the Enlightenment, and that is to me a real question and a difficult question and a question that keeps me awake at night, is first of all the Enlightenment, which has given us so much, human rights for one. It is always a movement that starts with an elite, but we live in a democracy. How is that supposed to work? We believe that democracy is the least bad of all forms of state we have ever found. So we believe that people should make informed choices. But it is by its very nature an elite project that only few people can lead. And the other problem is indeed, are people willing or indeed able, and I don't exclude myself, to live without irrational, to live without a part that is irrational, that speaks to them, to their irrational side? That has obviously been the role of religion in many societies. I think it could be the role of art in other societies. Perhaps art could do that for us. Possibly not much of the art we have today, but certainly a lot of the art we've had has been able to do that. There is no accident that people still listen to Bach and Beethoven, because that does speak to that irrational yearning in us. But whether a society that no longer has as a ratio this kind of irrational belonging together, that kind of tribalism, whether that can flourish, I think that is an historical experiment that is actually still open. And around 1900 you began to see that very strongly. You began to see these things splintering because people were pushed so quickly into a completely modern world. And Pierre and Marie, they went from a world that was still largely 17th or 18th century into one that could be recognizable in the middle 20th century within 10 years or so. Imagine what that does to them. To give you another example, which I once sat down and calculated, if an elderly gentleman drove down the Champs-Élysées in one of Mr. Renault's cars around 1910, then his grandparents could have still been born before the French Revolution, and his grandchildren would watch the moon landing on the television. And this is really the time when that flips. And it is so much for people to take in. Also, of course, it creates very strongly two worlds. A world of non-simultaneity, where in the countryside you have people who still do live in the 18th century or in the 19th. And in the cities you have people who already live fully modern lives with mass sports, mass entertainments, advertising, clocking in for work, buying products and no longer growing things yourself. The world we live in. Those two worlds existed side by side for a while, but you can imagine that, how terribly difficult it is to simply process that psychologically, that huge change. And on the scale of an entire society, you see, yes, movements that, incidentally, quite few, not very many, they weren't mass movements, interestingly enough. Perhaps because most people had been so desperately poor and disenfranchised that socialism became a mass movement. But the naturists, the transcendentalists, the anthroposophists, they were, the nudist vegetarians. There were a little fringe group. The nudists always in Germany, practically nowhere else. But the Germans really enjoyed getting their clothes off. Which is sort of weird. But you see that these movements are, really fringe groups. But when it comes to, a cult of something that obviously replaces a religious cult, whether it's the cult of Richard Wagner or the cult of Goethe, or those have huge following, because it is a way of finding a kind of meaning again. And of course then the nationalist idea that gives you the wonderful illusion that we have an essence as a people that is pure, and in its purity it is good and great, and we must only purify it and then we will be great again. And of course that has got nothing to do with any kind of historical development, which has always been marked by enormous streams and crisscrossings of migration on an individual, a group, and a mass level throughout history in Europe. Europe is the place where everybody comes and goes. So of course there is no pure people anywhere, as little as there's a pure language. And that of course, this is the great time of inventing national languages also, and writing great dictionaries. And but those were sort of poor man's metaphysics that allowed you to believe in something again. And if it was only the essence of Croathood or the essence of Germanhood, which was somehow magical and would solve everything. But the world was just not like that, and the world pushed people in a different direction. And you mentioned Freud. I find it very interesting. I think Freud is, together with Spinoza, one of the only two Jews that I know who made a great contribution to European history, very specifically as Jews. Gustav Mahler, for instance, wrote music that I think expresses a lot of assimilationist longing, but it is not particularly Jewish music. He didn't use Jewish melodies. He wasn't interested in biblical texts to set them to music. His music is the music of an immigrant who wants to belong, who always sees across the fence, or, we say, like a child who presses his nose against the window of a toy store and sees all the beautiful things inside but can't reach. But that is a story that any immigrant could have told. With Freud, it's very different, because his father was very old, and Freud is already very old, a generation older than Schnitzler or Mahler or so, almost. And he comes more or less directly from a shtetl into a great city. And he comes into a great city that is Catholic, and that is very important, because he looks at this Catholic world with Jewish eyes and thinks, now this is very funny. There is, not only in Viennese architecture, if you look at the Ringstrasse, but also in the individual lives, there is a complete contrast between the facade and the function behind. The facade must be great and beautiful and immaculate. And, if you look at the buildings embellished with classical education, just as people's dialogues had to be embellished with quotes from the classics, but the facade has to be immaculate. And as long as that is so, you're allowed to do whatever you like behind. You're allowed, man indeed is expected to have a mistress, some little shop girl whom he keeps in a little room somewhere. But of course that will never be mentioned in polite society. The facade must remain intact. But everybody knows that he does. And everybody knows that all the others do too. And there is this split world. Now, Freud can see this because he's not a Catholic, because he hasn't grown up in this world. And he can also see that this makes you sick in the long run. If you always have to separate these two things, if there's things that you're not allowed to acknowledge that are very important in your life, it doesn't mean that they go away. You can only sublimate so much. If you negate them, if you push them down, they will take revenge. They will come back. The second very Jewish thing that Freud then does, but that's only an aside, and then I must stop talking. The second Jewish thing that he does is he reads the dreams that he interprets, wrongly very often, I think, exactly like a rabbi would read a holy text. In a text in the Bible, the rabbinic idea is there are no mistakes. If there's something that looks like an obvious grammatical mistake, That is there because it has a hidden, deeper meaning. The Lord wants to tell us something. And now we must use all sorts of techniques which the rabbis spent centuries refining to find what that hidden meaning can be by substituting words, by juggling with words, and then you'll find. Now, Freud does the same with dreams. For Freud, in the dreams, there are no accidents and no mistakes. Even the most insignificant seeming detail is exactly the key to the deeper meaning that must be there. I think that's why many of his interpretations are nonsensical, because maybe some of our dreams are randomly firing neurons, and maybe some of the images we get in our dreams are simply nonsense, but if we insist that they're meaningful, we will create a meaning for them. But, this divide between the rational, perfect, beautiful facade and the irrational, tumultuous, chaotic world behind it, that becomes very much a preoccupation of this time. And it is no accident that that happens in Vienna and not in Berlin, which has a Protestant culture, which functions differently. It was a very Viennese thing to observe, but in order to see it, you needed to be an outsider.
U svakom slučaju Freudov...
Just one moment.
Yeah. U svakom slučaju Freudov pokušaj je bio herojski, koliko god danas znamo da je patio od mnogih zabluda. No da se vratimo na njegov simbolički značaj koji je svakako vredniji od konkretnih terapeutskih učinaka koji su bili sumnjivi već onda. Freud je simbol oslobađanja nagona od razuma. I svi ćemo se složiti da je i veličanstveno, i čak i racionalno osloboditi nagone. Vi ste govorili o erosu kao oslobađanju u najširem smislu, no imamo problem. Da li se oslobodio i Thanatos? I koliko je moćan? I koliko je oslobođeni Thanatos zamračio pobjedu oslobođenog erosa? Žao mi je što možda previše govorim u simbolima. Kad kažem Thanatos, mislim na politički iracionalizam, mislim na konzervativnu reakciju na sve dobro što se dogodilo prije 100 godina. Na rasne zablude, na nacionalističke zablude, na jednu užasnu mizoginiju koju je izazvao feminizam. Zato vas pitam o tom Thanatosu. Dok slavimo oslobađanje nagona, moramo znati da se može osloboditi i ono loše, i što je puno gore nego što možemo očekivati.
Well, first of all, I am the completely wrong person, unfortunately, to have a real discussion about Freudian theory, and I think his idea of the death drive is still Thanatos not as the death drive, but generally.
Would you please take this? Okay. Yes. Ja vas ne pitam da raspravljamo o Freudovoj teoriji. Nemamo potrebe o tome raspravljati. Ono što mene zanima je, imamo početak 20. stoljeća u kom se oslobađa nagon i to je divno. Međutim, vidimo da se oslobodile su užasne mračne sile. Oslobodio se, možda je ponajbolji primjer onaj serijski ubojica koga spominjete, Wagner, koji je čovjek živio urednim malograđanskim životom i u jednom trenutku je, što bismo rekli, pukao i počeo ubijati oko sebe. Dakle, nemamo samo, nije na dijelu samo Gustav Klimt, koji će u procesu oslobađanja naslikati provokativne i zanimljive slike. Na dijelu su i ljudi koji će se u procesu tog oslobađanja pokazati kao zvijeri. Dakle, ne pitam vas ništa freudovski. Želim raspravljati o antropološkom pesimizmu i antropološkom optimizmu.
Well, okay. I was only just starting to breathe with that introduction. And let's agree to keep out of that. I think, this idea of the serial killer today has a lot to do with living in anonymous places, but it has even more to do simply with technology. Try to see how many people you can kill with a knife. It's so much easier with a bomb or with an AK-47. People didn't have them in the Middle Ages. We don't know what happened to extremely brutal psychopaths in the Middle Ages, but they couldn't kill 50 people in one go. But the thing is, of course you are right that many good things have been liberated, but many bad things seem to have been let out of the bag as well. But I'm not sure whether that was really different before. You say the conservative reactionary reaction to every progress of humanity. Well, I would have thought most rulers were conservative and reactionary through most of human history. So I don't think that is a change of modernity. Of course, it is a change that can organize itself, that reaction.
Mogu da se ne složim. Ne bih se složio s vama. Svakako da su vladari od pamtivijeka bili konzervativni. Međutim, sa modernitetom je zlo dobilo novu kvalitetu. Kroz fašizam, kroz nacionalsocijalizam, kroz staljinizam.
Yes, that is true. But that new dimension of evil was not a new human dimension of evil, but a new technological one. Pizarro tried to kill as many people as he could in South America, but Auschwitz was so much more effective because there were the railways. And German ways of making timetables. It was all very well industrially organized. That was new, I think. Evil can be so much more powerful today. Good perhaps as well, but it is the technological dimension of evil that has changed so much.
Tu sada dolazimo do pitanja da li je tehnologija omogućila zlu da bude učinkovito, da li je ono postalo učinkovito zbog tehnologije ili je tehnologija samo oslobodila ono što je već dugo spavalo u čovjeku kao jednom, nećemo reći zlom, ali ambivalentnom biću. Dakle, je li Auschwitz posljedica dobrog voznog reda ili je posljedica ljudskih ubilačkih nagona gdje je vozni red samo pomogao da se realiziraju?
Well, I think these are, I'd love to really get into these questions for the next hours, but because they're important. But when in ancient Greece a war was waged with all those noble heroes that we still talk about, Perseus and Achilles and Hector, it was in the historical wars and even in Homer quite accepted that you would kill most of the men or enslave them, rape all of the women, put the children to the sword and set the city alight. That today to us is pretty evil. In a way, why could the US no longer win the Iraq war? I think it is for the simple reason that we no longer think it is acceptable what happened in all the wars before, up to and including the Second World War, namely that you went into a restive region where there was a rebellion going on, you herded all the men together, you strung them all up, you raped as many women as you could, and you left, and there would have been peace in that region for a while, for 10 years or 20. Now, we no longer think that is acceptable. We had huge headlines when in Abu Ghraib a few prisoners were attacked with guard dogs. That was a terrible thing to do, don't get me wrong. But you see, the dimensions of brutality have changed very much. Much of what we would have considered utterly evil was completely normal, even for people who thought a lot of their own moral standards in times past. Today, we sometimes only recognize it as evil because our ethical standards have changed. We now think somebody going into a region and completely flattening it is a terrorist and a criminal and not a war hero. And indeed, you know, a lot of people look sort of a little bit askance at anybody who wears a uniform because he must be a murderer. Our standards have changed. We were talking about that before this. You know, the idea that artists are on the left and in favor of peace and against war is something completely new in human history. It only came after the Second World War and because of the shock of the Second World War. Before that, there were a lot of right-wing reactionary artists and who wrote great paeans to murder, to slaughter, to putting, you know, to killing people, to the purifying power of blood and all these things. That was normal for artists to do that. Artists worked for great princes who were tyrants and serial killers themselves, and they decorated their cathedrals and their palaces. So I think I'm wondering whether, you know, this liberation of Thanatos that you speak about, if we can say the liberation of the deadly evil in the world, my instinct would be to say it's always been there. It is the kind of animal we are, and the more pressured we are, the more aggressive we get, which is normal for other primates too. And if we've got plenty, you know, we are relatively peaceful because we've got everything we need. Whether that is not simply a question of, on the one hand, individual deeds are magnified by technology, or indeed collective deeds. You know, it began with the murder, the worst murder possibly of the 20th century. Certainly the first great murder of the 20th century nobody knows about today was the King Leopold of the Belgians murdering something like 10 million Congolese people simply for financial gain, for no other reason. I won't go into that today, you can read it in the book, but you know, it was a horrific thing, but it was because he had the technological means to do that. The technological means to enslave large numbers of people, to put them into camps, to mow them down with machine guns, to surround them with barbed wire, that was new, that you could do that you can transport soldiers quickly over such long distances. I think if people had had that ability in centuries before, they would have done the same. It's not that they were in any way, you know, that the evil in them was still contained. They acted it out in more ritualized ways because they had less control over evil, they had less control over the world. So you had spectacular and very cruel executions. But I think they were in no way less evil. Technology has changed, and therefore a single terrorist can blow up 50 people just because he's got deranged ideas about religion, about biology, about race, about you name it. That has become possible. But also our own ethical standards have shifted so far that what seemed standard and indeed good in times past seems evil to us now. And incidentally, and I always think this is very important to remember this when you're working on history, so I'm really talking to myself here, we are not standing at the end of this process, and that which would enable us to have a sort of secure place from which to look back at history and judge things securely. We are on a very fast train ourselves. Everything is changing constantly. Our own vantage point is changing, and in the future, in a generation or two, people will think that we were evil. You don't have to look very far. I mean, first of all, their ethical standards may have changed yet again, but if you see what we have been done simply for our consumption to the climate, to people in other countries, that's pretty evil. So I think, you know, this idea that we have somehow become more evil, I wouldn't accept. You know this book by Steven Pinker, who argues that there's much less violence in the world today and that we've actually become better. I think you can argue with that, and you can argue with his numbers because they're not very exact, and other people have taken him up on that. And violence, how do you count that? Who is a victim of crime? Who is a victim of oppression? That's all very difficult. But I think we have definitely not become worse. It is just that people who have bad intentions have vastly greater technological possibilities of carrying them out. And perhaps you can say because of that, that has a sort of fallback effect on all of us, because that means that because technology also allows us now to exercise so much control, that our freedom is becoming more and more a rhetorical idea. Because we are actually controlled pretty much in every living, breathing moment, partly with the justification of controlling this potential for evil, but actually, of course, with many other reasons and motivations as well.
Izađimo iz tog začaranog kruga dobra i zla koji je i tako nerješiv. Ja bih spomenuo, vi ste spomenuli Leopolda, belgijskog kralja, koji je, ako govorimo o ovoj knjizi kroz dramatis persone, svakako najveći negativac knjige. No, zato bih spomenuo meni dva najdraža lika u toj knjizi, to su Anita Augsburg i Lytton Strachey. Zašto? Zato što su to dvoje ljudi iznimno aktualni za Hrvatsku danas. U Hrvatskoj je brak kao zajednica muškarca i žene ušla u Ustav pod pritiskom izvjesnih konzervativnih grupacija, a Anita Augsburg je još prije 100 godina govorila da je brak velika glupost, besmislica i užasno ponižavanje žene. S druge strane, Lytton Strachey je također prije 100 godina, što je možda svakako zanimljivo za nas danas ovdje, gdje imamo kult rata koji je vođen prije 20 godina između Hrvatske i Srbije. Dakle, taj čovjek je rekao da je obrana domovine potpuna besmislica i nešto nepojmljivo glupo sa stanovišta individualne slobode. Imamo dakle situaciju da su dva slobodno misleća čovjeka prije 100 godina rekla neke istine koje su i danas aktualne. Nije li tragična uzaludnost slobodne misli koja nešto izgovori i to ostane potpuno neprimjećeno, neshvaćeno i dešava se i dalje sve ono naopako protiv čega ti ljudi su govorili. U kakvim to konstantama živimo? Ja primjećujem jednu konstantu uzaludnosti izgovaranja istina. Smijem li biti toliko pesimističan? Shvatite to kao osobno pitanje.
Well, I love being optimistic, but it's not that easy being optimistic. But to lighten the mood, let me tell you my favorite Lytton Strachey story, which is fantastic. Lytton Strachey was an English writer. He was also as gay as you can be. Quite openly gay, as much as you could that be as an upper-class man in Britain at the time. And there were codes and everybody understood them, but it was again the thing of the facade and the thing behind. You had to keep the facade intact. But as you said, Lytton Strachey refused to enlist in the First World War, and he was called in front of a board of officers. And you can imagine these generals with their moustaches sitting there. And then he was asked the classic question that always comes. in these moments. But he found the best answer I think any living being has found, although that was very much limited to him. He was asked, so what would you do then if a German soldier came and started raping your sister? And Lytton Strachey simply said, I would endeavor to come between them. Which is wonderful. Think about it for a moment. He may have thought it was quite a nice looking German soldier. In any case, the potential for social liberation at this time was enormous. And you see that you mentioned Anita Augsburg, a German social activist for women's rights, and especially the rights, one has to say, of lesbian women. She lived together with a woman openly, and there was a curious hole in the German law, which was really rather glorious. And again, you see this sort of old generals drafting up the law, because homosexuality, of course, was illegal and could get you into prison, could ruin your professional life and your career and your social standing, and you had to be very, very careful. But that only applied to men, because obviously the Wilhelminian lawgivers thought women don't do awful things like that. So there were many openly gay couples, female couples, in greater German cities, but no openly gay male ones. But what is perhaps more significant also in the context of what you say about marriage is, this is the age of the first great feminist revolution. And don't forget, all these arguments have been made before, every 100 years or so. Mary Wollstonecraft made them in the Enlightenment. Indeed, people like Diderot made them in the Enlightenment, but they were forgotten. They were only the providence of a few people. But now you have mass media, and you can publish these things, and if they're scandalous enough, then the media will want them. And, a woman living with a woman and wearing short hair, hooray. And so she was a bit of a media personality, and that, of course, allowed people like her and herself to get her arguments across. There was a wonderful woman in Vienna called Rosa Mayreder, one of the first great feminists, who really pushed a polemic that was only taken up again in the 1970s. Very, very radical. Who asked, and she wasn't the only one, for a complete separation of procreation and sex. Who asked for an end to marriage as a demeaning institution to women. Who in fact said, the problem with the great cities, and that gets back to the being scared of modernity. She made a very, very clever analysis. She said, for most of history we've needed the strong arm of the man, and that was the governing principle of society. Because the plow needed to be pushed into the earth, and a sword needed to be wielded, and men are strong, they can do that. But she said, now living in a great city, if you work in a factory and you work on a machine, the important thing is to know which button to press and where to find the information for that. You don't need a strong arm for that. She said, the city is the end of masculinity as we know it. The male virtues, the masculine virtues which have been around for so long and extolled for so long, they are simply collapsing, because in this new world there's no longer any call for them. Now, there was a counter movement to that. There were never as many uniforms worn on the street as during that time, as many duels fought between men as during that time. There was the first great bodybuilding craze. I mean, being masculine, being a real guy with muscles and a big mustache and a sword was worth something at that time. And that was certainly to some degree a reaction to this. Indeed, there was a German doctor who wrote a bestseller which is called in German, in the original title, Über den physiologischen Schwachsinn des Weibes, so about the physiological imbecility of women, in which he tried to show that women simply have the smaller brains, they weigh less, they're a bit smaller, and therefore they can only be kept to children and church and kitchen, because what else can they do, the poor dears? Now that was a polemic that was quite, certainly in conservative circles, also among some women, was quite modern. But of course it was a reaction against a wave of change. And where did that change come from? That is really interesting, because there's the difference between a rebellion and a revolution is that a rebellion is poor people going on the street because they can't bear it anymore. And they get crushed, and that was it. That's what the London riots a few years ago, it flared up one moment, shops were looted, and then it was out again. A revolution needs middle-class people at the top who have strategic planning, and no revolution has ever been run by by workers. It has always been, the Stalins and the Lenins, and that happened especially in England with the suffragettes, because the movement was started by textile workers in North England, poor women who had children and 12 hours in the factory and a household to run, and who of course also in the factories for the first time had the possibility of exchanging themselves with hundreds of other women, all of whom had the same problems, and they said, we go on strike, we make a demonstration, we will act. And again, this moment of mass, because that's a big difference. These things, these ideas which have always been around, you find them in the 15th century, you find them in ancient Greece, but now all of a sudden they become constituting for a mass of people, not just for a few, and therefore they become huge social movements. These arguments are reiterated and are simplified and get into art, get into also a very important medium that starts then film, and all of a sudden you see that they become to seep into popular culture, and that they're not just between a few learned people who write books, but all of a sudden they become a political mass movement. And that really changed the world. If we have gay marriage today in many countries, that is very much due also to those people who were courageous enough to make these arguments for the first time. And of course, they were marginalized, they were despised. A woman in France, a very brilliant psychiatrist called Marguerite Dumas, she was locked up in an insane asylum and lived out the rest of her life there. I mean, these people had to have some courage to do that. Today, nothing much can happen to you, at least not in our countries, fortunately, if you say things like that. Back then it could. But they made these arguments, and these arguments stayed around. And that was dampened down by 2 world wars and by the different social issues. But finally it came up again a generation after the Second World War, as it should, if you look at it as an historian, as sort of generational changes. It came up in the 1960s and 70s. But, it is not surprising that countries where a church is very strong would resist that, because of course also these things have so much become the symbol of, to some people, everything that's wrong with the world. If 2 men can marry, then obviously we are all going to hell. One could be a little bit more relaxed about that and say, I really enjoy living together with a woman. But if somebody else really enjoys living together with a man, will our civilization really crumble? But obviously to some people it will, and that is, to my mind at least, a conservative rearguard action, because the world is simply passing those people by. The reality on the ground is simply passing those people by. I mean, I'm 45 and I grew up in a relatively small German town, and I grew up without homosexuals. There were none. Nobody mentioned them. And the homosexuals who were there, of course, knew not to act openly in public. Now, my parents weren't particularly bigoted, and indeed they had homosexual friends, but as a child you didn't notice that because the conversations were different, the codes of speaking were different. Imagine this immense change within only 30 years. That, now I've got the children of friends, they grow up and they love a gay couple we know, and they come and we have meals together, and it's perfectly clear that they're a gay couple. Indeed, they're married. That would have been impossible 30 years ago. We have come such an enormously long way, and the enormous visceral hatred of people like that is simply no longer there among ordinary people. It's a bit like cannabis. Too many people have smoked it that you can still pretend that it's a dangerous drug.
Završimo ovako optimistično.